Adrian Monck is the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum. Adrian, nice to have you with us, sir. And it's interesting, I'm reading out some of the concerns or even the conspiracies around the WEF. I'm assuming, as a man that does this for a living, you're familiar with all of these arguments.
I hear a fair few of them. It's funny, actually. I haven't. If you want a conspiracy, I was at uni years ago with James Delingpole, and if you want an even worse conspiracy, when I was a telly producer back in the 1990s, I put Julia Hartley-Brewer on TV. So you can see I'm really embedded.
We might have to end this interview here, Adrian. That's it.
I'm sorry. I know there are some crimes you can't be forgiven for.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I mean, but you're aware that when people talk about globalization, then they're quite scared of. Some are quite scared of globalization, and then you go down that kind of David Icke route, and people start to get itchy and think, oh, there's some big kind of cartel of businesses and shady governments and NGOs who are stitching together a plan to run the world. How do you respond to that? And I'm sure this is what people ask you in kitchens at parties as well.
Yeah, if there were parties anymore, they would ask me, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Look, when I grew up, I'm from Great Yarmouth, would you believe? And if there was a global conspiracy, I can tell you that Norwich City would be playing Bayern Munich at the weekend and not Bristol. And Delia Smith would be world president.
Yeah, that's true. Of course she would.
The reality is that, what we do is we try and get people who don't normally talk to each other to talk to each other. And that involves creating vehicles for them to have conversations. If you want to get someone to say something to somebody else and have a conversation that's not completely random, you've got to create a kind of architecture for it. And the architecture that we came up with in the light of COVID, which is obviously the biggest disaster to kind of hit everybody in yonks, is the Great Reset. Now, if you're a fantastic conspiracy theorist, you can say, oh, well, the World Economic Forum, you guys also, you did this thing, Event 201 back in November, before the whole pandemic came up, and you did it with Johns Hopkins University and the Gates Foundation, which is true. We did do it with that. And the guy who organized it, put it all on telly, put it all on YouTube, and no one paid a blind bit of notice to it, including us, actually. We think it's important that people think about these things, but in the great scheme of things, the guy who organized it was banging on the door saying it's very important. And everyone else said, well, sorry, financial ruin, climate change, all these kind of things, more important than this, so please get back in your box. And then when the pandemic arrived, in our position, trying to bring people together to have those conversations. And remember, when you're trying to convene these conversations, you're talking to government ministers in Colombia, you're talking to government ministers in Japan, you're talking to businesses based in Indonesia who might want to talk to businesses based in Brazil, about can they supply enough glass vials for vaccines. These conversations have to happen, and you have to have a format and a kind of rubric for them to happen. And that's what the Great Reset is. But if you're kind of angry and your job's gone and you're sitting at home wondering who's responsible, you probably look at it and go, blimey, those guys are, they're planning something. They're up to something. They're stitching all this together. There's some massive scheme afoot that's taking my job or putting me at risk. And, coming from Great Yarmouth, which frankly is, the most forgotten place on earth, and where I still have family back in Norfolk, I can relate to that. I know it feels like there's a big world out there where decisions are being made and things are happening that you can't control. But, I wish someone was flying the global plane, but I can tell you from my little perch here in Geneva that it's not that simple. And certainly it's not a conspiracy.
In basic terms, Adrian, this is, because somebody did say to me recently, the only thing, more worrying than lots of companies all getting together making plans would be lots of companies not getting together making plans. It would be ridiculous if we didn't have cohesion between oil companies or tech companies, and certainly in medicine as well. That's just to many, that's a no-brainer that you would get people together to talk.
It is, because they're not people who naturally like coming together. Most companies are rivals. Pepsi and Coca-Cola don't, have office parties together and sit down and admire each other's drinks. In the world of business, big business tends to stick to itself. And actually trying to create the facilities and the kind of, environments where they can talk to each other and have conversations that aren't just kind of, platitudinal, but actually come to something. that's where we come in. And the biggest criticism we normally get is not that we actually do things. The normal criticism we get is, well, you guys don't do anything. You're just hosting conversations. You're just encouraging people to pointless chat. And then on the other hand, suddenly you try and organize another conversation on something that takes off, and people say, oh, you're not organizing pointless chat. You're actually, reworking the world in a way that's really suspicious and crafty. And, we're really scared about it. So I'm not saying it's a no-win situation. It isn't, but it's something where I think it's understandable that people are, worried about what's going on in the world and look to, conspiracy theories and, organizations like ours to say, oh, there's something going on here, because, that's what people are like.
Let me throw a couple of questions that when I mentioned on social media that you were coming on, lots of people piled in with questions. Jalath says, does capitalism need a little Marxism to survive the fourth industrial revolution, or a whole lot? And how much influence does the forum have over international governments?
Well, not enough that I can, pick my mobile up and dial up a head of state. We obviously have connections with governments and ministries about different things, and we have connections with businesses about different stuff. I think, it's a no-brainer that, capitalism red in tooth and claw needs restraining. Every single economy on the planet has rules and regulations about what companies can and can't do. And, in order for us to have a smoother, better operating system in the world, probably makes sense for us to have those conversations on a global level about some things like climate change. We have the same size shipping containers everywhere in the world. That's because at some point people got together and said, wouldn't it be sensible if we all had the same size shipping containers? Now, that didn't suit everyone, because some people have tunnels that shipping containers won't go through in the current size. And you have to kind of have those kind of ins and outs and interests taken into account. But those conversations are important, because otherwise the world economy stays stuck.
This in from Angela. Ask why they see fit to take away what we own. And this is a reference, I think, to a video. You know where I'm going with this. A World Economic Forum.
I do know where you're going with
video that says it says something. It's imagining a future where things.
Future.
Yeah,
so
and it actually says on it that you won't own anything. What's going on? Why do you want to take away my iPhone, Adrian?
Yeah. So this is a lovely piece that was actually written by a Danish politician called Ida Aukens, who's still in Parliament in Denmark. And she was asked to back in 4 years ago, she was asked to imagine, along with a bunch of other people, what life would be like in 2030. And so she wrote this very nice essay sort of saying, I won't have anything. I will live in a sort of cashless society and wander around in a kind of pretty much Danish utopia, a kind of IKEA with extra meatballs. And sorry, I know IKEA is not Danish, it's Swedish, but you know what I mean.
But they do meatballs.
They do meatballs, and this very charming piece, which is one of like hundreds of pieces that we publish, because we try and publish lots of people with lots of different opinions as a way of kind of being a platform for people to share their views and what they think. Not all of which we agree with. This has been kind of floated up recently as like, well, it's hiding in plain sight. These people, they want to take everything away from us. It's like, well, and they're not democratic. And it's like, well, okay, it's not our opinion.
So it was an author piece. That wasn't
it's an author piece.
But it wasn't made clear on the video, though.
It actually says underneath the tweet with the video, and it links to the piece, because the video is trying to get you to read the piece. And the piece says, this is by Ida Aukens. She's a Danish politician. And by the way, it's her opinion, and you don't have to go along with it. And we certainly don't endorse it, because if we endorsed everything that we had, we've had Donald Trump come to the forum, we've had Joe Biden come to the forum. So you've got to stay neutral on those kinds of issues, and we try and stay neutral in order to keep conversations going.
This one comes in from Kalo, who says, is the World Economic Forum just Agenda 2030 in disguise? I don't even know what Agenda 2030 is. Do you?
Well, Agenda 2030 is actually something that I think Mark Malloch Brown came up with. He used to be a foreign minister for Gordon Brown years ago. Yeah, and he came up with it, and it's like the SDGs basically, which is a horrible term, social development goals, and it's how. And again, you sort of think to yourself, why do organizations come up with these terrible kind of acronyms and these kind of long lists of points? It's like 17 SDGs. I wish I could name all of them. Probably in my job, I ought to be able to, but I can't quite go through every single one. And the reason they do it is the same sort of reason we come up with things like the Great Reset, because they want to be able to talk to people in all sorts of different places with all sorts of different backgrounds about a shopping list of things. And so Agenda 2030 or whatever, I think, is the timeline by which Mark Mallet-Brown, who happens to be a Brit, said when he was UN Deputy Secretary General, could we get people to, get clean water for everyone by that date? Could we get this by that date? Could we get that by this date? And there's 17 of them, far too many to kind of get movement. But because he put them all down, you can kind of check off against them, and you can kind of organize conversations. Because if you want to talk about clean water with companies and governments, it helps if you all say, well, look, there's a UN thing about clean water. Let's all try and agree on that, rather than saying, how clean does the water have to be? Where do we start the chat? Where do we start the discussion? And this is how the international world works. And by the way, I think people should be concerned about it because it's really slow and frustrating, and it's really bureaucratic. But it is kind of how the world is. I mean, and my frustration with it, which you perhaps can feel in how I express myself, is that it is like that. And I'm a former journalist. I want people to pick the phone up and solve problems and get on and do stuff. But unfortunately, the way we have to organize ourselves with all these different players in the world is around this kind of language. And it ends up with people going, Agenda 2030 is deeply secret, it's deeply conspiratorial.
But is it fair to say, though, Adrian, that there is an agenda? It might not be nefarious and it might be perfectly reasonable, but there is over there at the World Economic Forum, along with the man that started it, Klaus and the like.
Klaus, yeah.
You have an idea of what you want the world to look like, and you are trying to shape it in his eyes or in his ideology and the ideology of the forum.
Yeah, I mean, look, he's a good old-fashioned German from the 1940s and 50s, basically. So he grew up in a ruined country where business had to put society first. You couldn't just say, well, sorry, Germany can stay collapsed. We'll just turn our backs on it and make a buck. And so he has this idea that business is about more than just making money, that it's a kind of stakeholder capitalism idea, which he's been banging on about for 50 years and sort of finally has become a little bit trendy. Although, not with an 84-year-old German probably behind it, but it's finally people are kind of liking the idea of, businesses ought to stand for something a bit more. And, that agenda is about as far as you can go. That's really where it is, and does that include being concerned about climate change? It does. If you happen to not believe in climate change, then sorry, we tend to take the scientific evidence and say, well, we probably ought to try and do something about it. The other side of it is trying to warn people about long-term stuff, because what the forum sees is we try and look at long-term risks that people don't talk about, which is why we get involved in talking about things like pandemic risk, which is really niche and which, let's be honest, before January 2021, no one gave, two hoots about. Whenever you talked about it, people would be like, well, yeah, really, come on. Let's think about finance, let's think about other stuff. So we try and nudge people in that direction, and we try and use evidence from, experts who work inside the forum to kind of make the argument that there's generally, if you want better economies, you have to have, more equal distribution of wealth, you have to have better legal systems, you have to have rule of law, all of these things kind of help to deliver better results. Don't believe us, look at the kind of, look at the evidence.
So you would
that's
say
as far as it goes, because ultimately governments, governments elect, or people elect governments, and governments, don't turn around to us and ask for.
So they don't.
You know,
So
the
governments
recipe for success.
don't defer to you. So hand on heart, then I ask this only because
I only wish, you know, they did, and you know,
it would be,
and
yeah,
that,
it would be a very powerful
life would be
position.
so much easier.
But hand on heart, Adrian, you're saying there is no global conspiracy then where you're in bed with Bill Gates and the like and all manner of other people to inoculate a nation through a world through vaccines, stop democracy, reduce rights, reduce ownership, and have a kind of almost a slave population lurking planet Earth that a cartel of only very influential and rich business people are in charge of, and the rest of us are just puppets.
Yeah, I feel a bit for poor old Bill Gates, because, you know, a guy who, you know, couldn't get the bugs out of Windows 95 is somehow supposed to be able to, you know, create a vaccine that's going to enslave humanity. You know, we're not, unfortunately, able to do much more than try and get people together on Zoom calls. So, you know, beyond that, to having kind of conversations with experts and with governments and with businesses to try and put people on the same page on some stuff. You know, that's really as far as it goes.
Okay.
So, you know, we're just a Geneva-based version of talkRADIO with a few policy wonks attached. I'm afraid.
I like it. And just finally, then, just to where we started, then, if you could, Adrian, in a couple of sentences, then, just sum up exactly the Great Reset, so we can put this to bed once and for all. What is the Great Reset?
I wish this would put it to bed once and for all. The Great Reset's really about saying, you know, we're hugely challenged by COVID-19 and what it's doing to people's livelihoods, what it's doing to economies, and what it's doing to, you know, the global economic system. And when we think about the future, can we please think about putting people first, thinking about how we give people meaningful, decent jobs, putting effort into reskilling them, putting effort into retraining people, so that when we're in this big technological shift that's going on at the same time as this pandemic struck, we can actually make sure that people come out the other side better off, better trained, in a better space. And that we also perhaps come out with a greener economy, with better air to breathe, you know, with better results for the world in which we live. And, you know, those kind of rather modest hopes, I think, are probably in different forms shared by people across the political spectrum. Even President Trump, you know, champions one of our initiatives about planting 1 trillion trees. So, you know, we're trying to engage people from all sides of the political dynamic, and help to, you know, nudge things in a direction that might be a little bit like progress. But that's it. Real progress will only come when Norwich win promotion next year to the Premiership.
So I knew you'd start talking ridiculous at some point. But Adrian, it's great to have you on. Thank you. Adrian Monck, Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, the man that put Julia Hartley-Brewer on telly and went to university with James Delingpole. I never considered for 1 second firstly, I never considered he was going to sound like that. I think I speak on behalf of all of us on that point. And secondly, I didn't. Or from Great Yarmouth. And the other two factors were just slight curveballs on his part. I'm sure that has continued to divide the room.